Angela Turner was the kind of teacher parents trusted and students admired, but behind her polished smile and perfect reputation, 5 boys Ethan, Ryan, Jason, Caleb, and Tyler were about to become trapped in a scandal so dark it would destroy families, shatter lives, and turn a respected classroom into the center of one of the most disturbing true crime stories the community had ever seen. Lavra Mitchell was known throughout the quiet suburban town as the kind of teacher every parent wished for their child. She was polished, patient, and carried herself with an air of calm authority that made her instantly likable. She lived in a modest house with her husband and 2 young children, her life appearing from the outside like a model of stability. Parents praised her dedication, students admired her energy, and colleagues saw her as someone who kept everything in perfect order. But beneath that carefully maintained image was a woman restless with dissatisfaction, a wife who felt trapped in a routine marriage, and a teacher who began stepping into dangerous territory that would eventually consume her entire life. Her troubles did not begin suddenly. Over time, her marriage had grown stale. Her husband, once attentive, had become consumed with his own responsibilities, leaving Lavra feeling overlooked and invisible in her own home. Each evening ended in silence, meals became mechanical, and intimacy had long vanished. In the classroom, her students looked at her with admiration and curiosity, offering her the attention she no longer received at home. It was this subtle shift, a dangerous craving for validation, that pushed her toward decisions that would haunt her forever. At first, the boundaries she crossed were small, so small that she could almost convince herself that nothing was wrong. She laughed too freely with certain students, allowed conversations to linger beyond schoolwork, and created a sense of familiarity that blurred the professional line she was meant to uphold. Those moments gave her a thrill she could not ignore, a spark she had not felt in years. What started as innocent gestures slowly turned into something deliberate. She singled out a handful of students, 5 in total, and began giving them special attention. Their grades improved without effort, and their excuses were always accepted. For them, it was flattering, confusing, and exciting, but for Lavra, it became an escape from her crumbling reality. Her affair with the students developed in shadows, carefully hidden from view. It was carried out in places no one would think to question. Sometimes it was after class in empty rooms, other times outside of school where secrecy could be maintained. Lavra believed she was in control, that her intelligence and position of authority allowed her to orchestrate everything without risk. What she failed to see was that every interaction created a trail, a fragile chain of secrets waiting to break. The students, though young and inexperienced, felt empowered by their connection to her. They held a secret that set them apart from their peers, and that secret bonded them together in ways that Lavra had not anticipated. They compared notes, shared stories, and began to realize that they were not the only ones receiving her attention. The excitement that once fueled them slowly gave way to tension, jealousy, and resentment. Outside of school, Laura's husband noticed changes in her behavior, though at first he brushed them aside. She began working later, claiming she had papers to grade or meetings to attend. Her phone, once left casually on the counter, was now hidden in her bag. She avoided eye contact when he asked simple questions, and her excuses became a regular part of their evenings. He told himself she was just tired, that perhaps he was imagining things, but deep inside he felt the first stirrings of suspicion. At school, small rumors began spreading. Students who were not involved noticed how Lavra favored certain boys, how she laughed at their jokes in ways that felt different, how they always seemed to linger near her desk. Whispers filled the hallways, dismissed by most as exaggerations or the usual gossip. Teachers were too busy with their own lives to pay close attention, and administrators, trusting Laura's reputation, never questioned her conduct. The secrecy allowed her to continue unchecked, but the walls were slowly closing in. Lavra believed she had mastered her double life. She balanced the face of a caring wife and mother at home with the mask of a professional teacher during the day. Yet beneath those layers, she nurtured a hidden world that fed her ego and dulled her loneliness. The thrill of deception became addictive, and she could not stop even when warning signs surrounded her. Every risk she took brought her a rush of excitement, but each step also pushed her closer to exposure. The students involved began to carry the weight of their secret differently. Some felt proud, convinced they were part of something unique. Others carried guilt, realizing that what they were part of was dangerous and wrong. The conflicting emotions created cracks in the secrecy Lover relied on. One of the boys started withdrawing from his friends, struggling with the pressure of keeping something so explosive hidden. Another grew reckless, flaunting his confidence and making comments that hinted at more than he should have revealed. Their actions stirred curiosity among classmates and the rumors gained momentum. Lavra ignored the signs. She told herself no one would believe teenagers over her, a respected teacher with a spotless record. She underestimated how quickly trust could shatter once suspicion began to spread. The small town that had once admired her was about to become a stage for her downfall, though she remained blind to it. At home, the cracks in her marriage widened. Her husband felt her slipping further away, but instead of confronting her directly, he grew resentful and cold. The distance between them grew unbearable, yet Lavra welcomed it, convincing herself that she had already found what she was missing elsewhere. She had no idea that her husband's quiet observations would eventually play a role in the tragedy to come. By the end of that year, Laura's life was divided into 3 fragile pieces. The image of the perfect teacher, the reality of a distant wife and mother, and the secret life of a woman entangled with 5 of her own students. Each world demanded a different version of her, and the strain of keeping them separate began to take its toll. She had built her life on deception, unaware that the very people she thought she controlled would soon be the ones to bring everything crashing down. The stage was set for exposure. The boys were restless with conflicting emotions, the classmates were whispering, and her husband was quietly piecing together clues. Lavra, still convinced of her own control, walked deeper into the web she had spun. The quiet suburban town remained unaware of the storm about to break. But when it came, it would not only destroy her life, but unravel the lives of everyone connected to her secret. The silence of secrets could not last forever. Among the 5 students entangled in Lavra Mitchell's hidden life, one began to feel the weight more heavily than the rest. His name was Ethan, a boy who had once been quiet and obedient, but who now found himself unraveling under the pressure of what he carried. At first, the secret had thrilled him. He felt chosen, special, as though he had unlocked something no one else could ever understand. But as the weeks passed, guilt gnawed at him. He could no longer focus on his studies, his behavior grew erratic, and the boy who once followed every rule began skipping classes, staying out late, and snapping at his parents. They had no idea what he was hiding, but they sensed that something dangerous was pulling him away from them. One night, unable to carry the burden alone, Ethan confided in a friend. His voice trembled as he revealed pieces of the truth, not everything, but enough to suggest that something was very wrong between him and his teacher. His friend, overwhelmed by the revelation, promised to stay silent but felt the story burning like fire. Within days, the secret spread. It leapt from one student to another, each person adding their own interpretation until it became impossible to tell fact from rumor. Still, one detail remained consistent. Laura Mitchell, the respected teacher, was at the center of it. The hallways filled with whispers. Students stole glances at Lavra, some with suspicion, others with curiosity. A few dared to joke about it in hushed tones, but beneath the laughter was unease. The rumor was too heavy, too explosive, to dismiss as ordinary gossip. It carried the weight of something real, and the longer it spread, the more dangerous it became. Lavra sensed the change in the atmosphere. She noticed how conversations stopped when she entered a room, how students stared at her longer than usual, how laughter erupted in corners she could not reach. She brushed it off, telling herself that teenagers thrived on exaggeration and lies. But deep down, a sliver of fear began to grow. The other boys involved reacted in different ways. One, named Ryan, became reckless. He strutted through the hallways with a confidence that drew attention, whispering hints to his friends and boasting in ways that made others suspicious. To him, the relationship made him powerful, but his arrogance was dangerous. Another, Matthew, felt consumed by jealousy when he discovered that he was not the only one Lavra had chosen. The secret that once made him feel special now made him feel disposable. His anger simmered, and he too began leaving traces that pointed toward the truth. At the same time, Laura's husband grew increasingly uneasy at home. He noticed her excuses piling up: late nights at work, sudden errands, unexplained absences. The woman who once shared her thoughts with him now locked her phone away and avoided his questions. He began to pay closer attention. Sometimes he caught her staring blankly at nothing, a small smile tugging at her lips as if lost in thoughts she could not share. He told himself that maybe she was simply tired, maybe he was overthinking, but the pit in his stomach deepened. He could not ignore the signs forever. Within the school, suspicion began to creep into the staff as well. A counselor overheard fragments of conversations from students that suggested more than simple rumors. Another teacher noticed how Lavra seemed to favor certain boys, how her interactions with them were more casual, more intimate than with others. None of them wanted to believe it. She had always been reliable, always professional. The idea that she could cross such a boundary seemed unthinkable. But the whispers refused to die, and each passing day the pieces began to fit together too neatly. Lavra believed she could maintain control. She reassured herself that teenagers lied, that no one would believe them over her. But paranoia slowly seeped into her mind. She grew sharper in class, snapping at students who giggled, cutting short conversations that felt suspicious. The mask of the perfect teacher began to slip, and the cracks were visible to those who looked closely. Still, she clung to her secret, convinced she could outsmart the storm building around her. Ethan's guilt, however, grew unbearable. His grades collapsed, and his parents, alarmed, demanded answers. He avoided their questions, shutting himself away in his room, where he stared endlessly at the proof he carried: messages, notes, and small tokens that tied him to Lavra. He wanted to forget, to erase everything, but he could not. The secret chained him, and the weight was too heavy for someone his age to bear. His sleepless nights and trembling hands gave him away, and his friend, worried, finally told another adult. The fragile wall of silence crumbled a little more. Laura's husband, meanwhile, decided to take his suspicions seriously. One evening, while she showered, he went through her bag. He found nothing conclusive but the absence of ordinary items: papers she claimed to be grading. Notes she once kept struck him as odd. He grew more determined to uncover the truth, watching her every move with quiet calculation. His patience was thinning, and the more distant she became, the more he convinced himself that something dark was happening right under his nose. The turning point came when Ryan, intoxicated by his own pride, let his guard down. At a party, surrounded by peers, he hinted too strongly at his involvement with Lavra. His words spread quickly, passed along from ear to ear, until half the school was buzzing with certainty rather than suspicion. Teachers could no longer dismiss it, administrators could no longer ignore it, and the community that once trusted Lavra began to sense that the whispers were more than idle talk. Lavra felt the tension tightening around her like a noose. The walls of her carefully constructed life were closing in. The students who once gave her a sense of escape were now liabilities, each one a potential threat to her secret. Her husband's silent observations grew colder, sharper, as though he already knew the truth. The school's administrators began to make quiet inquiries, asking questions that sounded harmless but carried hidden weight. Everywhere she turned, Lavra felt watched. Every smile seemed false, every laugh felt directed at her. She told herself she could survive it, that she could still manipulate the story, but in her heart she knew the truth was beginning to surface. She was losing control. The rumors that had started with Ethan's trembling confession had spread like wildfire. They had reached the ears of the staff, the eyes of her husband, and the restless hearts of the students entangled in her secret world. The truth was inching closer to the surface, and it was no longer a matter of if she would be exposed, but when. The life she had built on deception was starting to unravel thread by thread, and the quiet town that once admired her would soon witness a scandal that would shatter every illusion of safety they had once believed in. The unraveling of Lavra Mitchell's secret life reached its most dangerous point when the first solid piece of evidence appeared. For months, the rumors had been only whispers, words carried between students and fueled by suspicion. But whispers could be denied and gossip could be silenced. Evidence, however, had the power to destroy everything, and it came from the very students she had once believed she controlled. Among the 5 boys, one had grown tired of the secrecy and the manipulation. His name was Matthew, and what had begun as excitement for him had soured into resentment. He once thought he was unique to Lavra, special in a way no one else could be, but the realization that she had been equally involved with the others cut him deeply. The admiration he once held for her transformed into jealousy, then into anger, and finally into revenge. Matthew was not content to keep the truth hidden anymore. Unlike the others who were drowning in guilt or flaunting their involvement recklessly, he decided to act with precision. Over the months, he had quietly saved messages that Lavra sent him. He had photographs, scribbled notes, and proof that went far beyond rumor. At first, he told himself it was only insurance, a way to protect himself if things ever went wrong. But his anger grew with each passing day, and soon the idea of exposing her became irresistible. Lavra had played with his emotions, and he wanted her to pay for it. The decision was not sudden. He wrestled with it, torn between fear of the consequences and the satisfaction of bringing her down. Eventually, the desire for revenge outweighed everything else. Matthew took the evidence he had collected and anonymously sent it to the school board. He disguised his involvement carefully, slipping the documents into an envelope with no name, no return address, and dropping it where it would surely be found. When the packet landed on the desk of an administrator, the whispers that had haunted the school for months were suddenly given undeniable weight. The administrators approached the situation cautiously at first. They were shocked, unable to reconcile the image of Lavra Mitchell, the dedicated teacher, the woman admired by parents, with the content in front of them. Still, they knew they could not ignore it. A quiet investigation began, not with loud accusations, but with careful steps designed to confirm what they now suspected. They spoke to students, starting with those who had been closest to Lavra, piecing together stories that matched far too well. Each interview revealed more, painting a picture of a teacher who had blurred the lines of trust and responsibility beyond repair. Lavra, meanwhile, sensed the shift before anyone told her directly. She noticed the way administrators watched her with sharper eyes, how colleagues seemed more distant, how conversations ended abruptly when she walked into the room. The students who had once been eager in her presence now seemed wary, uncertain of how much longer they could stay silent. The pressure mounted, and for the first time, Lavra felt the walls closing in for real. Her husband, too, began to piece things together more concretely. He had been watching her closely for weeks, quietly cataloging her excuses, her late nights, and the guarded way she kept her phone near her at all times. One evening, his suspicions were confirmed when he stumbled across a message she had overlooked. It was brief, but it was enough to unravel any hope that his doubts were wrong. The betrayal was no longer just a suspicion, it was fact. Rage and humiliation flooded him, though he kept silent, waiting, watching, and letting the anger simmer beneath the surface. Back at school, the investigation deepened. What had started as one anonymous envelope soon turned into a pile of evidence as more students came forward with their own pieces of the puzzle. The administrators could no longer dismiss it. The rumors were true, and the evidence was undeniable. Parents began to hear the first whispers of scandal from their children, and fear gripped the community. The thought that a trusted teacher could betray the very students she was meant to protect was almost too much to believe. But the facts were mounting, and the truth was impossible to bury. The boys who had once been silent participants now found themselves pulled into the spotlight. Investigators questioned them, and their stories matched in ways that left no doubt. Some cried, others grew defensive. But together they created a damning case against Lavra. Each detail revealed added another layer to the truth, and the image of the respected teacher crumbled piece by piece. The community that had once admired her began to turn, their trust shattered, their anger rising. Lavra, desperate to maintain control, tried to deny the allegations. She told herself that she could manipulate the narrative, that her word would outweigh the voices of teenagers, but the evidence was too strong. The administrators had the messages, the notes, the proof that could not be explained away. What terrified her most was not just the threat to her career, but the knowledge that her family would soon know everything. The double life she had built with such care was collapsing, and she had no way to stop it. Her husband's fury grew with every passing day. He felt humiliated not only as a husband but as a father, knowing that the woman he had trusted with his children had destroyed their lives with her choices. He avoided confronting her directly, instead stewing in silence, his mind circling darker and darker thoughts. The betrayal had cut too deep, and he no longer saw a way to repair the damage. The community, once quiet and ordinary, became a place of chaos and suspicion. Parents whispered angrily at meetings, demanding answers, while students spread every detail they could find. The school that had been a pillar of stability now stood at the center of scandal, and Laura's name was spoken with disgust and disbelief. Matthew, the boy who had first exposed her, watched it unfold with a twisted sense of satisfaction. His revenge had worked. He had torn down the woman who had betrayed him, though he never considered the full scope of the destruction he had unleashed. He had lit the match, and now the fire spread uncontrollably. By the time the truth became undeniable, Laura's world was in ruins. Her reputation was destroyed, her career was hanging by a thread, and her family was slipping away from her. The investigation had pulled her secret life into the light, and nothing could put it back into the shadows. She had thought she could control everything, but she was wrong. The students she had believed she held power over had become the very ones to end her life as she knew it. What had started as a hidden affair, carried out in secrecy and arrogance, had become a full-blown scandal. And as the school board prepared to take official action, as the authorities stepped closer to her door, Lavra realized that the destruction was only beginning. The lies had finally caught up to her, and the cost would be greater than she had ever imagined. The scandal that had been building for months finally reached Lavara Mitchell's home, and it was there that the darkest turn began. Her husband had been living with growing suspicion for weeks, and by now he no longer needed anyone else to confirm the betrayal. He had seen enough, heard enough, and pieced together enough to know his wife was not only unfaithful, but had destroyed the life they had built together. What he could not comprehend was the scale of it, the fact that the betrayal involved students, boys the same age as the children who trusted her every day. For him, the humiliation was unbearable. Each day he carried the weight of knowing that neighbors, colleagues, and parents were whispering behind his back, perhaps already laughing at his blindness. The marriage that had once seemed ordinary but stable was now poisoned by lies, and his anger grew with each passing hour. Lavra sensed his distance but avoided it. She focused on her own panic as the investigation into her conduct gained strength. Rumors had hardened into fact, and whispers had turned into open condemnation. Colleagues no longer met her eyes, administrators kept their voices clipped and cold, and students openly stared at her in hallways. At home, she tried to pretend everything was normal, cooking dinner, helping the children with homework, sitting across from her husband at the table. But beneath the surface, tension boiled. She knew he suspected, and she knew she could not hold him at a distance forever. The final blow came the night he discovered undeniable proof. While she was asleep, he unlocked her phone, guessing the password after months of watching her guard it so fiercely. What he found shattered whatever restraint he had left. The messages were explicit, the photos undeniable, the details so sickening that he felt his entire body seize with rage. She had not only betrayed him as a partner, but had humiliated him as a man, a father, and a member of their community. He sat there in the darkness, scrolling through her secret life, feeling each word and image slice through him. By the time he put the phone down, something inside him had broken beyond repair. The confrontation began quietly. At first, he demanded answers, his voice low and trembling with fury. Lavra tried to deflect, offering excuses and denials, but the evidence was undeniable. Her husband was not interested in words anymore. He wanted her to feel the devastation she had caused. The more she spoke, the angrier he became. The years of resentment, the humiliation of her betrayal, and the knowledge that their children would grow up with this stain on their family all exploded at once. The fight escalated quickly. It moved from words to shouts, from shouts to threats, and then into something violent that could not be taken back. Fueled by rage, he lashed out in a way that stunned even himself. Lavra, who had once believed she was untouchable, suddenly found herself at the mercy of a man she had underestimated. In the chaos of that night, she lost the control she had clung to so desperately, and her double life came to a brutal end. The neighbors heard nothing until it was too late. The street was quiet, the houses dark, the suburb cloaked in the illusion of safety. But when the flashing lights arrived, painting the night in red and blue, the truth spread quickly. Police swarmed the house, carrying out a body while her children were rushed into the arms of relatives. The image of Lavra Mitchell, once the respected teacher and trusted figure, now lay shattered on the floor of her own home. The investigation shifted from scandal to tragedy. What had begun as an affair that threatened her career had ended as a crime scene. Detectives pieced together the sequence of events, uncovering the affair, the students, the evidence, and finally the rage of a husband who could not bear the betrayal. The town that had been buzzing with rumors now stood frozen in shock. Parents who had once trusted Lavra to guide their children now spoke of her with anger and disgust, but their outrage was mixed with horror at the way her life had ended. Her husband was arrested that same night. He sat in silence, offering no resistance as police took him away. In the interviews that followed, he confessed without hesitation. His words painted a picture of a man who had been pushed beyond his breaking point, someone who had endured humiliation until his anger consumed him entirely. The community struggled with how to see him. Some viewed him as a murderer, someone who had taken the law into his own hands. Others saw him as a victim, a man whose life had been destroyed by betrayal so deep it had driven him to madness. The children were left in the middle of it all, suddenly without a mother and without the comfort of a stable home. They were shielded from the details as much as possible, but the whispers followed them everywhere. Their classmates knew, their neighbors knew, and no matter where they turned, the shadow of what their mother had done and how their father had reacted hung over them. They became living reminders of a scandal that had consumed an entire town. In the days that followed, the media descended, circling like vultures on the quiet street. Headlines screamed of the affair, the betrayal, and the murder. Cameras captured every detail, broadcasting the story across the state. What had been a private scandal contained within the walls of a school was now public knowledge, dissected and debated by strangers who had never met Lavra or her family. The once respected teacher was reduced to a cautionary tale, and her husband became the face of rage and tragedy. The school itself struggled to recover. Administrators held emergency meetings, parents demanded answers, and new rules were hastily put in place to prevent anything like this from happening again. The teachers walked the halls in silence, their trust shattered, their profession stained by what one of their own had done. Students, too, were left shaken. Some were angry, others confused, and those who had been directly involved were pulled into an endless cycle of questioning, their young lives permanently scarred. The town's sense of safety evaporated overnight. The community that had once believed in its schools, its teachers, and the sanctity of family life could no longer pretend everything was normal. They looked at each other differently, wondering what secrets might be hiding behind the closed doors of their quiet suburban homes. Laura's story became a reminder that darkness could thrive anywhere, even in the most ordinary places, and when it finally surfaced, it could destroy everything in its path. For her husband, there was no turning back. His act of violence had ended her life, but it had also ended his own as he knew it. He sat behind bars, replaying the night in his mind, knowing that the rage that had consumed him had left his children orphaned in all but name. He would spend the rest of his life paying for a single night of fury, while the woman he had loved and despised lay buried, her secrets exposed for the world to see. The scandal had become tragedy, the affair had become a crime, and the Mitchell family, once an ordinary household in a quiet town, had become the center of one of the darkest stories the community had ever known. The trial of Angela Turner became one of the most discussed cases in the state, and every detail that came out in court shocked those who followed it. The courtroom was packed with reporters, parents, and curious onlookers who wanted to know how a respected teacher, wife, and mother could have led such a double life. The prosecutors painted her as a manipulative predator who used her authority and position to lure students into intimate relationships. They presented text messages, hidden photographs, and testimonies from the boys themselves, each describing how they had been drawn into something they did not fully understand. The defense, however, attempted to shift the blame, portraying the boys as willing participants who exaggerated events after being caught. They argued that Angela was lonely in her marriage, emotionally unstable, and taken advantage of by manipulative teenagers. But the jury saw things differently. The evidence was overwhelming, and the contradictions in Angela's statements only damaged her credibility further. Angela sat in silence as the verdict was read. Guilty on multiple counts of misconduct, corruption of minors, and abuse of authority, each word seemed to carve deeper into her. Her husband, who had stood by her during the initial stages of the investigation, finally walked out of the courtroom, his face pale and expressionless. The image of him leaving became symbolic of the life she had lost, the trust she had destroyed, and the family that would never recover. Her children were placed in the custody of relatives, too young to fully grasp what their mother had done, but old enough to feel the shame it carried. The sentencing was harsh. The judge made it clear that Angela's actions were not just personal mistakes, but crimes that left deep emotional scars on her victims. She was sentenced to more than a decade in prison, with no chance of parole for the first 7 years. The courtroom gasped as the punishment was announced, but many parents in the community felt it was still not enough. They had trusted her with their children, only to find out she had exploited that trust in the most devastating way. Life behind bars was far from what Angela had known. The woman who once stood in front of classrooms now stood in line for meals, stripped of all authority and respect. Her fellow inmates knew her story and reminded her of it constantly. Her name became a symbol of betrayal and corruption, and she quickly learned that prison was not just about confinement, but about constant reminders of her downfall. Yet even there, she struggled to face what she had done. In her letters to her family, she continued to frame herself as misunderstood, as someone who had been caught in a storm bigger than she could handle, rather than someone who had willingly destroyed lives. Outside prison walls, the scars lingered. The students who had been involved each carried their own burden. Some withdrew into silence, avoiding eye contact and retreating from their peers. Others rebelled even more, spiraling into reckless behavior that worried their families. Therapists tried to help them, but healing was slow. The humiliation of being known as one of Angela's boys weighed heavily, and whispers in the hallways of the school never fully died down. Even years later, when some of them tried to move on with college, jobs, and relationships, the story of their past followed them, always threatening to resurface. Angela's old school replaced her quickly, but the shadow she left behind lingered. Parents became more cautious, teachers were scrutinized more closely, and the trust between educators and families was never quite the same. The scandal became a cautionary tale told at teacher training sessions and school board meetings, a reminder of how fragile the line of trust can be and how easily it can be broken when someone abuses their position. As for Angela's husband, he filed for divorce within months of her sentencing. He refused to allow her name to stain his life further and fought for sole custody of their children once she was released. His bitterness was well known in the community, but few could blame him. He had been betrayed in the most humiliating way, forced to stand in public while the world dissected his wife's affairs with students half her age. The marriage was over long before the papers were signed, but the legal separation marked the final severing of what had once been a respectable family. In prison, Angela aged quickly. The years wore her down, and when she was finally released, she stepped into a world that had moved on without her. Her name remained tied to her crimes, her reputation beyond repair. No school would ever hire her again, no neighborhood would ever truly accept her, and her children wanted little to do with her. She lived quietly in a small apartment, her days filled with silence rather than classrooms. She was once a woman with authority, influence, and admiration, but now she was a reminder of how choices can destroy everything. Her story remained on the shelves of true crime documentaries, watched and dissected by strangers across the world. Viewers shook their heads, some blaming her, others questioning the boys, and a few wondering how such scandals could keep happening. But for those who lived through it, the families, the students, the community, it was more than a documentary. It was a wound that never fully healed, a memory that resurfaced every time her name was mentioned. Angela Turner had become a cautionary tale, proof that beneath the surface of ordinary lives, dark and destructive secrets can fester until they explode in ways that leave scars for decades. The case remained a chilling example of how power, trust, and temptation can collide with devastating consequences. It was not just about one woman's downfall, but about the ripple effect of her choices on everyone connected to her. The scandal destroyed reputations, damaged futures, and left a permanent stain on a community that once believed it was safe from such stories. For Angela, there was no redemption, only the hollow reality of a life stripped of respect, love, and purpose. And for those who watched her story unfold, it was a reminder that sometimes the most disturbing crimes are not committed by strangers lurking in shadows, but by the familiar faces we trust the most.